Good morning. It's so nice to see everyone up so bright and early. I'm Erin Scallern, registered dietitian at McLean Children's in Temple, Texas, and I am co-moderating with DG Jennings. It's been great throughout the conference that the topic of weight neutral care has been coming up, and so we are super excited to present this information to you guys. So we'll have DG come on up.
Hello, everyone, and good morning. Just a couple of housekeeping notes. So we are going to have a Q&A after each presentation. So if you are thinking of questions or something comes up for you during any of the presentations or as we're presenting, please feel free to use that app and just go ahead and put it right in. Erin is going to be monitoring that for us. And then we do also have this mic, so please feel free to come on up after each presentation. We'll have a little bit of time for questions. So my name is DG Jennings, and I am a social worker at the University of Virginia Adult Cystic Fibrosis Clinic. I have no relationships to disclose related to this presentation, but I do have several unearned privileges that have shaped my own experiences and beliefs. I am continuing to unlearn those harmful attitudes and perceptions that contribute to implicit bias. I'm a white, non-Latina, non-Hispanic, cisgendered, often passing for straight person with a master's degree. And I'm going to start by talking about the social context of weight and body size, CF and nutrition today. Then we'll spend the bulk of our time talking about weight-centric care and why a weight-neutral approach. Since this presentation is going to touch on weight-centric care, and weight management and diet as a form of weight loss, we must start by first looking at the social and cultural context of weight and body size. People in larger bodies are subject to weight-based discrimination in education, the workplace, healthcare, and society in general. You can see this in the fact that people in larger bodies are less likely to be promoted and has a significant impact on their income. You can see this in society in general in the fact that we don't have seats on buses that are big enough for all types of bodies. You can see it in airplanes. People in larger bodies who are part of other outgroups experience increased levels of weight-based discrimination. For example, women are more likely to experience weight-based discrimination than men. Fat phobia, anti-fatness, and weight stigma in the US are rooted in ableism, healthism, and our history of anti-Blackness, slavery, and colonialism. And moralistic judgments are placed on people based on their body size. These judgments stem from the belief that their weight is due to a lack of self-discipline and a lack of personal responsibility. There is a really wonderful joint international consensus statement for ending the stigma of obesity, which I would highly encourage anyone interested in this topic to check out. It's in my references, and it has some useful definitions, which I've put up here. Weight stigma refers to the social devaluation and denigration of individuals because of their excess body weight and can lead to negative attitudes, stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. I want to note that often when we talk about weight stigma, we're talking about people in larger bodies, but there is some research, and I'm just going to very briefly touch on it here because I could talk about this subject for hours, and I won't make you all sit here for that. But weight stigma, there is some research that it does affect people in all body sizes, that your perceived experience of weight stigma can be really independent of your actual body size. Weight-based stereotypes include generalizations that individuals with overweight or obesity are lazy, gluttonous, lacking in willpower and self-discipline, incompetent, unmotivated to improve their health, non-compliant with medical treatment, NCF, and are personally to blame for their higher body weight. Weight discrimination refers to overt forms of weight-based prejudice and unfair treatment towards individuals with overweight and obesity. Weight bias internalization occurs when individuals engage in self-blame and self-directed weight stigma because of their weight. Internalization includes agreement with stereotypes and application of these stereotypes to oneself and self-devaluation. I want to consider for a moment, perhaps you are a person in a larger body size, or perhaps not, perhaps you haven't ever experienced that. That's totally fine. But just pause for a moment and imagine if you were someone who was receiving these messages so much that you internalized them and believed that you really were lazy and unmotivated, and that whatever health issues you were facing, they were your fault. Explicit weight bias refers to overt, consciously held negative attitudes that can be measured by self-report. Our next speaker is going to talk about this more. I would say that this is the more obvious form of weight bias, but much often I think that we and our patients experience this sneakier implicit weight bias, which consists of automatic negative attributions and stereotypes existing outside of conscious awareness. Healthcare models are built within these contexts. This is reflected in the research funding and design in healthcare models and in medical language. The BMI was developed with and for the bodies of white Western European men, and the Latin term obesis actually means having eaten oneself fat. This medical terminology inherently assumes that obesity is the direct result of caloric intake and implies that it is therefore the person's fault. Similarly, the term overweight implies an ideal weight for everybody and that fat bodies have deviated from the ideal and are in need of management and correction. It creates an inherent hierarchy of body size with thinner people at the top and fatter people at the bottom. When quoting research and the work of others, I will be using some of these terms because they are all over the scientific literature. But when speaking from my own perspective and my own practice, I will primarily use the word fat or talk about people in larger bodies. When talking about the research, I might refer to so-called normal weight. I often will use the term straight size in my own practice. Messaging about the obesity epidemic and moralistic judgments about larger bodies inevitably result in fat people desiring to lose weight. And I want to acknowledge too that there is a massive industry globally worth over $190 billion this year that helps perpetuate this. Our healthcare system has been built within this harmful societal context. And I know we're all here this weekend because either we are a person with CF, we're a family member of a person with CF, or we're striving to provide high quality care to all people with CF. And to do that, I believe we must shift the paradigm away from this context. This shift requires not only the absence of further weight stigma and discrimination, but the active unlearning of beliefs and perceptions that reinforce weight stigma and anti-weight bias. And I realize that it's like 7:15 a.m., so I know that was a big ask for you on Saturday, and I just want to say thank you so much for coming to engage in this work. When talking about implicit bias, I think it can sometimes come across as lecturing and hectoring. I, as a person with privilege, do not want to stand here and talk about how discrimination creates feelings of shame in those who are being discriminated against, and then by saying this, also create shame within my listeners and sort of foster this endless cycle of shame. I don't think that does anything for healthcare clinicians, and most importantly, I don't think that does anything to help people with CF experiencing discrimination. And that, after all, is who this presentation is for. I want to acknowledge that I think it's normal to feel feelings of resistance, to feel feelings of anger and denial and shame and hurt when confronting injustice. And as a social worker, that is really where I come to this work. We have a responsibility to reach out and to offer services to our most vulnerable populations and to advocate for them. And I encourage everyone during this presentation and those that follow that as I ask you to engage with us in this challenging work, be attentive and accepting of your own internal experiences. There is no wrong way to feel. If you notice any strong reactions or feelings of discomfort, it is worth pausing to ask where those feelings are coming from and why they might be happening, and explore any of those feelings that arise with open and non-judgmental curiosity. I know that we all know this because it's been talked about many times, but I just want to remind everyone that where we've gotten today started with this landmark study in 1988 by Corey et al. That found an increase in growth and survival rate for patients with CF who followed a high-fat diet with aggressive pancreatic enzyme replacement therapy when compared to CF patients on a low-fat diet. That, in turn, led to high-energy, high-fat diets becoming the standard of care for CF an emphasis being placed on weight gain and achieving a minimal BMI goal. And recent evidence suggests that people with CF today are continuing to eat energy-dense, rich, nutrient-poor foods. People with CF on highly effective modulator therapy have to eat fat foods when taking modulators, and the increasing prevalence of overweight and obesity is being seen in the CF community within the context of highly effective modulator therapy. I'm going to focus during this presentation on how we provide healthcare to straight-sized and the growing number of fat people with CF and those who may be experiencing unwanted weight gain that can at times feel distressing and outside of their control. But again, I want to acknowledge that this is a problem for all people with CF, regardless of body size. This is the last brick I'm going to throw at you, I promise. I realize this is a huge wall of text, but it's so important that I wanted to put it up. There's this really fabulous evidence-based nutrition practice guideline for people with CF, and it includes this conditional recommendation. For all individuals with CF, it is reasonable for the registered dietitian or international equivalent to advise an age-appropriate, healthy diet that emphasizes culturally appropriate foods associated with positive health outcomes in the general population, including vegetables, fruits, whole grains, seafood, eggs, beans and peas, nuts and seeds, dairy products, and meats and poultry, as tolerated and preferred by the individual with CF, because there is no evidence to suggest that routine modification from a well-balanced, healthy diet is associated with improved outcomes. It is reasonable to advise supplementation with energy and/or protein-dense foods or oral or enteral supplements as needed to achieve or maintain normal growth in pediatrics or BMI status in adults. This recommendation, while excellent, is not enough alone to inform a clinician's approach to providing nutritional support to people with CF. The ways in which a so-called healthy diet are counseled to people with CF can vary widely based on the approach taken. My hope is for both my presentation today and for this session as a whole to demonstrate the importance of providing these recommendations within a weight-neutral approach to care. Often recommendations to an age-appropriate healthy diet are made in the general population within the paradigm of weight-centric care, which is currently the widely prevailing paradigm in clinical practice. You might also hear this referred to as a weight-normative approach. I'm going to primarily refer to it as a weight-centric approach, but those terms are used synonymously. Weight-normative and weight-centric care are terms that I want to focus on because I believe the tenets provide a lot of insight when compared to our present state of nutrition in CF care. So as we look at those tenets of weight-centric care more closely, I want to emphasize that a person with CF, perhaps an adult who prior to starting highly effective modulators had to focus primarily on weight gain, may still hold many of these weight-centric beliefs. But those beliefs feel very different when on highly effective modulators they are gaining weight, perhaps in a way that feels out of control and activate fears and concerns they may have never had before. When acknowledging the social context of weight, one of the bullet points I talked about was about moralistic judgments around weight and body size. And as we take a closer look at some of these tenets, I want to ask the question, how might weight-centric care impact moralistic judgments around weight and body size? How does weight-centric care connect with weight stigma and anti-fat bias? So looking at these tenets side by side, the first one was the belief that weight is under individual control. And as a person with CF, I think they may have experienced that, particularly if modifications in calorie intake were successful and resulted in desired weight gain in the past. If we compare that side by side with one of the consensus statements on the stigma of obesity, which I referenced earlier, what the research tells us, in fact, is that causal attributions of personal responsibility for obesity are associated with stronger weight bias, whereas lower levels of weight-based stigma are associated with stronger beliefs in genetic and physiological or environmental causes of obesity. The idea that the causes of obesity depend on individuals' faults, such as laziness and gluttony, provides the foundation for a stigma against obesity. Second, the belief that weight gain is caused by an imbalance in calorie intake and energy usage. I want to point out how totally logical a thing that would be to think if you were a person with CF, and how in the past, weight-centric care, where we've had that target BMI, has really kept people with CF alive and was really valuable to them. And I think it's perfectly logical for a person with CF to think to themselves, all right, if I gained weight by increasing calories, then I can lose weight by restricting calories or increasing my energy usage through exercise, as though it's a simple mathematical equation. You hear this in the general population and on social media in terms such as energy in, energy out, or calories in versus calories out. But those terms are misleading because they inaccurately imply that body weight or fat mass are solely influenced by the number of food calories ingested and the amount of energy burned through exercise. This narrative is not supported by evidence and provides a foundation for popular, stigmatizing views that blame individuals' lack of willpower for their obesity. Third, the belief that health status can be predicted by weight. Again, a totally reasonable thing to think if you're a person with CF or a parent or caregiver of a person with CF, because you've been watching your kiddo get weighed at every visit and you've received tons of education that having that minimal weight is super important. The focus on a high-fat diet has greatly benefited people by improving lung function and increasing survivability. So, if you're used to this belief that health status can be predicted by weight, how does that stack up to the existing research? And again, I want to be clear, this existing research is in the general population. We urgently need some of this research in the CF population as well. Our existing research in the general population tells us that, in fact, aerobic exercise and fitness has been a much better predictor of health risk than BMI. So what that means is that regardless of size, the amount of exercise someone engages in predicts their health way better than BMI. Similarly, a study showed that cardiometabolic measures much better predicted health than BMI. And the study found that nearly half of overweight individuals, 29% of obese individuals, and 16% of obesity type 2 or 3 individuals were metabolically healthy, whereas over 30% of normal weight individuals were cardiometabolically unhealthy. Again, we think of weight stigma primarily as being something that impacts people in larger bodies, but it can also do a disservice to people in straight-sized bodies. Sometimes there's an assumption that they're healthy because they're a healthy weight, and things get missed. Fourth, the belief that excess body weight causes disease and early death. This messaging is everywhere in the media. People with CF and their families have certainly been exposed to this messaging in their personal lives and likely in their healthcare as well. And I want to get interactive for a moment here and see how many people in this room might have been exposed to that messaging. I'm a millennial, so I'm going to date myself a little bit with some of these questions, but I'd like to see a show of hands. Who here watched Super Size Me? That's a lot of us. Okay. Who here has ever watched The Biggest Loser? Have you ever seen My 600-Pound Life? Okay, very near and dear to my heart. Who here has watched Mean Girls? Nice. So you may remember there's this scene with Regina George where she's wearing sweatpants and she comes because she's been gaining weight, which is a totally normal thing that happens to teenagers. Lots of us gained weight when we were in high school. And she shows up to the table with her other cool friends, the other mean girls, and she's wearing sweatpants because none of her other clothes fit. And they tell her that she has to go sit at another table because this is not the day for wearing sweatpants. And I want to think about how that would feel if you were someone worried about gaining weight and you were seeing messages all the time that you were unlovable, that you couldn't fit in, that your friends would kick you out from your lunch table, which is of supreme importance when you're in high school, because you were gaining weight and it was out of your control. So thinking about that, let's see, how does that actually fall in line with the research? Is it actually really unhealthy to be overweight? Well, studies report that associations between BMI and morbidity or mortality often fail to control for important mediators and moderators, such as social determinants of health, weight stigma, weight cycling, insulin resistance, mental health, and health supporting habits. It seems probable that body weight is, for the most part, a proxy for what I would describe as a cluster of a bunch of unmeasured variables. It is extremely difficult in studies, as all of the researchers in the room know, to separate out one single variable from a big cluster of things. And so when we're studying BMI, are we really looking at BMI, or are we looking at poor people? Are we looking at people who maybe are of a specific race or ethnicity that genetically are more likely to be overweight and are also experiencing other health discrimination? What are we actually looking at, and what does this cluster tell us? But most importantly, let's say the research we were able to identify perfectly, exactly today, that yes, it is sheerly the amount of adipose tissue in people that is causing these health risks. It doesn't have anything to do with weight cycling or insulin resistance or the myriad ways they experience weight stigma on a daily basis. Now what? Can we offer them reasonable and sustained long-term weight loss? A weight-centric care tenet tells us the belief that methods for successful long-term weight loss involve the modification of eating and exercise patterns. And a person with CF has likely been exposed to this. This is the current widely prevailing paradigm in healthcare today. And they may have received this information from their CF care team, from their primary care provider, or from other clinicians. However, when we look at consensus statements on the stigma of obesity, which has compiled a ton of experts in the field and looked at a massive amount of research, we see that there is a widespread assumption, including many medical professionals, that voluntary lifestyles of diet and exercise can entirely reverse obesity over long periods of time, even when severe. This assumption runs contrary to indisputable scientific evidence demonstrating that voluntary efforts to reduce body weight activate potent compensatory biologic responses, such as increased appetite, decreased metabolic rate, that typically promote long-term weight gain. You all may have heard that people on diets gain it all back, and the studies do support that. And you may also have heard that some of them not only gain all the weight back, but they in fact gain more weight, which does happen to about 1/3 of people. And you will also notice, if you ever start digging into the research on weight loss through diet and exercise yourself, that those studies have a massive dropout rate, because even if they're only 6 weeks long, it is a completely unsustainable lifestyle for many people for 6 weeks. I want to pause and consider that if we offered another treatment to people with CF and we said this will work, but we knew that the research was this unpromising and showed that for so many people it was unavailable for them to lose weight, and certainly that they wouldn't sustain it, would we offer that treatment, and could we call ourselves clinicians who practiced evidence-based medicine? Last tenet, the belief that losing weight will result in better health. Again, people with CF have been taught to place a high importance on BMI, and that can naturally create the belief that there is a correct or ideal weight range, and that to be outside of that weight range will result in worse health outcomes. In most weight loss research, however, it is not possible to attribute health improvements to changes in weight as opposed to changes in behavior. And studies on weight loss interventions that report short-term improvements in health frequently do not differentiate the effects of the intervention, such as changes in exercise, nutrition, clinical or group support, from changes in weight. So think back to that research about how exercise is a great predictor of health. If someone is losing weight, is it the weight loss that improved their health, or was it the exercise? Or maybe they're suddenly eating a lot more fruits and vegetables. Is that maybe what improved their health? Weight-centric care relies entirely on the premise that weight can be controlled by an individual. And I want to highlight again that research indicates that prejudicial attitudes towards obesity, particularly feelings of dislike, are associated with perceived control, that obesity is self-inflicted. That is to say that you are much more likely to experience or to be prejudicial towards people who are obese or fat if you believe that it's controllable. And our next presenter is going to talk a lot more about weight stigma in healthcare. But I just want to say that, again, the quality of healthcare is adversely affected by weight-based stigma. Fear of prejudice and internalized weight bias can cause direct and indirect harm to patients with obesity, as they are less likely to seek and receive appropriate treatment for obesity and other conditions. Weight-based stigma and internalized weight bias can be particularly harmful to mental health, increasing risk of depressive symptoms, anxiety, and promising lower self-esteem, social isolation, stress, and substance abuse. Adults and children who experience weight-based stigma are more likely to avoid exercise and physical activity, which I would say is fairly ironic, and to engage in unhealthy diets and sedentary behaviors that increase the risk of worsening obesity. Stop and think about that for a moment. If you had been encouraged to do something, to engage in a diet and exercise program to lose weight, perhaps many people have done those over and over again, and they've yo-yo dieted, and you've had no sustained or long-term success, you might start to feel pretty hopeless, and you might think, what's the point? You might feel feelings of shame, and then just eat anything, because it doesn't matter. There's no point. Some public health campaigns indeed appear to embrace stigmatization of individuals with obesity as a means to motivate behavior change. I want to emphasize the research does not support that approach at all. So why a weight-neutral approach to care? Now that I've given a brief overview of the effects of weight-centric care, its link to weight stigma, and the lack of research supporting diet and exercise for long-term sustained weight loss, I hope I have whet your appetite for an alternative. We have 2 other presentations later in this session focusing on how to implement a weight-neutral approach or non-diet approach to care, but I want to give you the why behind weight-neutral care. A weight-neutral and non-diet approach focuses on supporting health-related behavior change rather than focusing on weight management or weight loss. And a weight-neutral approach has gained attention as a paradigm shift to reducing experiences of weight stigma in healthcare. Research evaluating the impact of weight-neutral interventions is ongoing, and further study is needed. Existing research on weight-neutral and non-diet programs indicates they may create positive changes in the following areas: fruit and vegetable intake, diet quality, physical activity, self-esteem, and quality of life. I want to pause and think back to those very 2 brief slides I had at the beginning talking about what the reasonable recommendations were when we're providing dietary recommendations with people to CF. A lot of those things I mentioned are up here on this slide. Improving diet quality, improving fruit and vegetable intake. Weight-neutral approaches are also addressed in the Nutritional Considerations for a New Era, this fabulous CF Foundation position paper. And it said, quote, "While no studies on weight-neutral approaches exist in CF yet, these alternative methods are becoming popular in the general population, particularly in individuals who struggle with body image issues, eating disorders, and weight stigma. CF care teams should be aware of these methods and should consider weight-neutral approaches for people with CF who struggle with body image issues and disordered eating." And I want to point out, I know this is probably fairly apparent to all of you, but you don't always know who has an eating disorder. You don't always know who has body image issues. And anytime that we're engaging in a weight-centric approach, there is a chance that we're talking with someone who's already been in a very deep and lonely and private way struggling with serious body image issues. My favorite thing about weight-neutral approaches as a social worker is that it lets us look at the whole picture. Weight-centric care can mean making treatment recommendations after primarily or even only looking at weight. Increasingly, I know there's a lot of talk about body composition as well. I would say with that, there is a concern that we're just trading one number for another number that people have very limited control over. Weight-neutral care focused on supporting behavior change invites us to look at the whole person. And before making recommendations in a weight-neutral approach to care, I really wanted to make a Vanilla Ice joke here so badly. But it actually would be more correct to say stop, listen, and collaborate. I'm still secretly hoping that you all have that sound stuck in your head all day, though. And these are all the many things that we're able to look at that influence behavior when we engage in a weight-neutral approach to care. We can look at experience to response to hunger and fullness cues, which may or may not exist, and which often people with CF needed to eat when they weren't hungry because they needed to keep their weight up. So asking them to think about hunger and fullness cues in a different way, that's a real stretch. We want to know how much energy a person has, what their culture says about eating and exercise. Do they have values, beliefs, or religion or ethics that dictate how they eat and exercise? What are their own perceptions and beliefs about food, exercise, and weight? How's their mental health? How's their body image? And most importantly, what access do they have to food, medications, and ways to exercise? I want to say here that I would be remiss if I didn't acknowledge that as clinicians, we may get people with CF who come to us desiring weight loss through diet and exercise. And I think sometimes when people get really into this research and they get really excited, the minute someone comes to you and says, I want to lose weight and I want to go on insert fad diet here in order to lose weight, the reaction is to immediately say to them, no, don't do that. The research doesn't support that. I would encourage you instead to stop and listen first and learn about their reason for the desired weight loss. Are they desiring it for their health? Or maybe are they also wanting to lose weight because of those many social pressures? People have extremely reasonable desires to lose weight. And I think it's important we validate that and we normalize that and we say, yeah, lots of people have asked me about this. Lots of people have expressed wanting to lose weight, because that belief that they want to lose weight they're hoping maybe it'll relieve some dissatisfaction in their body image they're experiencing, or emotional distress. Maybe they want to be able to sit at their lunch table again. They want people to like them. They want to avoid societal stigma and its consequences. They're getting pressure from family, friends, work colleagues, and healthcare providers. So I would say when that happens, this is our opportunity to provide gentle education on what research tells us about the ability of diet and exercise to provide sustained long-term weight loss. To say, yeah, that's a normal thing to want, and I understand why you're asking that. And it's my responsibility as a provider to tell you, here's what the research tells us, and here's what I think we can expect if you pursue that. I'd be remiss as a social worker if I didn't mention some resources. I'm behind, so I'm gonna fly through them, but know that these slides are available, and if you all need resources, I can put them out on the listservs after this. The CF Foundation has created a fabulous toolkit for care teams for social risk factors, and it includes a lot of information on how to screen for social risk factors, including food insecurity. And the CF Food Insecurity Committee has really done a ton of tremendous work on this issue. There are a lot of great resources on addressing body image, specifically for people with CF. And NEDA, the National Eating Disorders Association, is a great resource for eating disorders. In closing, I'd like to say that, as a reminder, people in larger bodies experience weight-based discrimination connected to larger cultural forces of racism, ableism, and healthism. Beliefs and attitudes surrounding weight-centric care perpetuate these experiences, and weight stigma has a negative effect on the quality of healthcare. People in larger bodies are less likely to seek care due to a fear of discrimination and internalized weight bias. Weight stigma and internalized weight bias can have a negative effect on mental health. Weight-neutral approaches are gaining increasing attention because it shifts the paradigm from focusing on weight to supporting behaviors that improve diet and exercise. And weight stigma in healthcare creates an injustice for fat people and people who experience that stigma. It is imperative that we endeavor to address this injustice. And that's all I have for you today. So I'm guilty of running over time. So what we're gonna do is we'll have a Q&A after Nita's. Again, we will be happy to go over your questions then. But for now, I'm delighted to ask Nita to come up and present to you. Aaron. Do we close out? Yeah, sorry, thanks. And then, okay. Okay, and they told me you have to click it once. And then you.
Thank you all for coming this morning. I know it's very early morning for everyone. I am going to attempt to do some surveys to engage the audience a little bit. So if you want to just go to the website or scan that QR code or even text to the number there on the screen, I'll give you guys a few minutes. Hopefully this works. I spent about an hour with the tech people who are amazing, so hopefully this works. My disclosure is not really related to this topic, but more importantly, I think the place of privilege that I'm coming from, I don't need to worry about my own physical, mental, emotional safety. My socioeconomic status gives me great privilege. I'm cisgendered, heterosexual, I'm married, I've got children, and I've got a body size that some might not consider straight-sized, but I don't have problems fitting into chairs or fitting into clothing for the most part. I also want to do a land acknowledgement. I acknowledge that I am from Treaty 6 territory, the homeland of the Métis. And right now, I believe that we're on the ancestral lands of the Akmal Odam. Please forgive me if I mispronounce that, and the Peeposh communities. I want to pay my respects to the First Nations and Métis and Indigenous peoples and reaffirm our relationship with one another. As a healthcare worker, I also acknowledge that there is systemic racism within and throughout our institutions, and that we all have the responsibility and the power to create culturally safe and appropriate environments for care. All examples of patients in this talk are examples based on real patient experiences, though the exact details have been changed in order to protect patient identity. So before we get started in the meat and bones of my talk, I wanted to have you guys reflect and do a bit of a thought experiment. So imagine case one. Case one is a 16-year-old, otherwise healthy female whose BMI is 15. She restricts her diet to 1,000 calories a day in order to lose weight. She restricts her meals to one meal per day and meticulously counts her calories on MyFitnessPal. She exercises for at least 60 minutes per day. She's unhappy with the way her body looks. She feels like she needs to lose weight in order to achieve an ideal health. Achieving ideal body weight has consumed her thoughts, she continues to restrict food and expend more calories through exercise. Now think of case two. Case two is a 16-year-old, otherwise healthy female. Her BMI is about 45, and she's been overweight her whole life. She's been counseled to lose weight through exercise and diet in order to achieve a healthy body weight. She starts to restrict her diet to 1,000 calories per day with intermittent fasting, and also meticulously tracks her diet on MyFitnessPal as suggested by her healthcare providers. She exercises for at least 60 minutes per day. She's congratulated when she loses a bit of weight by her peers and by her physicians because she is on her way to achieving health. She's unhappy with the way her body looks. She feels like she needs to lose weight in order to achieve ideal health. And she feels like further calorie deficit is needed in order to achieve a healthy body weight. So this is our first experiment in whether or not this is going to work. But I'd like you to submit your answers to that first question while I, whoops. Whoop. It should be there at the top there, the QR code. Maybe I need to present. Exit. There you go. You should be able to scan it, and it's all there at the top. Hopefully that works. All right. It might run out of responses if you're not able to. Hopefully you are. But it looks like nobody chose case one. Good. Some people chose case two. Most people chose both. And some people said, I have no clue. So both is the correct answer. Not the results I was expecting, which is good. Did her job. Yes, Dee Dee did do her job. It was very different the last time I gave this presentation. So the objectives of my talk: what is weight bias and weight stigma? How does it affect patient care? And how can this affect care in patients with cystic fibrosis? For the purposes of my talk, I'm defining overweight and obesity as being solely on BMI alone. I know that there are other better ways of measuring overweight and obesity, and whether we even need to define that or not. What I'm not here to discuss is the validity of BMI, other ways to measure adiposity, how weight loss can or can't be achieved, and what a healthy BMI actually means. So a lot of people might be thinking, I don't have weight bias. I woke up at 7:15 in the morning to come to this talk. That's not a me problem, that's a them problem. But if you imagine every time you wanted to change your body weight in order to body shape or body size in order to fit into that clothing, every time that you judge somebody for what they look like, thought, oh, you know, that person shouldn't be eating that chocolate bar, or I'm not going to take a donut this morning because I don't want to be judged. That's all bias. So what is weight stigma? Weight stigma, I found this, this sort of algorithm for defining weight stigma. Weight stigma is a social stereotype and misconception about people with obesity. And weight stigma, I think, can be divided into three domains here: public, provider-based, and structural. Public is what you see in the media, for example. Provider-based is what physicians and physician offices sort of the stigma that they have there, and structural is more of a structural issue within society. And each three domains can be divided into three parts as well: cognitive, affective, and discriminatory. So cognitives are ideas and beliefs, affective are feelings that somebody's feeling within themselves, and discriminatory are behavioral aspects. Weight bias is, on the other hand, is negative attitudes towards people. It's a social rejection and devaluation that accrues to those who do not comply with prevailing social norms of adequate body weight, shape, leading to negative stereotyping and discrimination. So as Dee Dee had said, there's implicit and explicit bias. Explicit bias is that conscious negative attitude that's represented by discrimination and prejudice against social groups. So this is, oh, did you see that person? Did you see the way they looked? Or so-and-so looks like they've gained weight. Implicit bias, on the other hand, is that unintentionally providing better treatment to a thin person versus a heavy person, despite having no conscious negative attitudes towards heavy individuals. Somebody described implicit bias as kind of that bias that creeps in when you're really tired. And you can't really think about what you're doing, and you just are on autopilot. Thinking about bias, if you were to search pictures of obesity on the web, these are the kind of pictures that typically come up. They're all very unflattering. They're all very beige, headless individuals usually. I wish we'd see a bit more of this, and hopefully in the future we will. So what are the effects of weight bias? In general, weight bias has a lot of effects, as Dee Dee's outlined very well in her talk. Weight stigma and discrimination have a vast impact on the quality of life of individuals living with overweight and obesity, including higher probabilities of showing unhealthy eating and activity behaviors. But weight bias in healthcare, I think, is a really important thing to talk about. There's strong implicit and explicit anti-fat bias amongst physicians. And also in physicians that are considered obesity specialists, there's a high amount of anti-fat protein, implicit and explicit bias, with words used to describe obese people such as lazy, stupid, and worthless. And this is amongst physicians that consider themselves obesity specialists, which I think is shocking. Some people may think, oh, we're getting better. I've seen plus size models. But over time, it seems that things aren't actually getting better. There was a study done, granted a bit old now, in 2014, looking at more general bad feelings towards fat people compared to thin people, actually in 2013 compared to 2001, where a theme that came up was that fat people were lazier than thin people. And this is within healthcare. Weight bias in healthcare is something that exists for everybody working in healthcare, right? So doctors, nurses, dietitians, psychologists, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, speech and language therapists, exercise physiologists, there's really no exemption. But does it actually harm people? Well, it does. Studies have shown that weight bias results in individuals avoiding routine and preventative health care because they're worried about being judged based on their body weight. They're worried about a health condition or a symptom that they're feeling being just blamed on their body weight and dismissed. It can also result in psychological distress and morbidity, as well as increased risk of mortality, which is shocking. This was a scoping review from 2019 that came up with 10 themes of weight bias and healthcare utilization, which I thought was quite interesting. So people found that there was contemptuous, patronizing, and disrespectful treatment. There was lack of training, so ineffective advice offered by their primary care provider. There was feelings of ambivalence, attribution of all health issues to excess weight. Health professionals' assumptions about patients' weight gain and what was causing that weight gain, barriers to healthcare utilization, expectation of differential healthcare, low trust and poor communication. There's also this idea of doctor shopping as a result of differential healthcare treatment, which if you imagine you're going to a physician to try and get help for shortness of breath, and that physician said, well, that shortness of breath is actually caused by your weight. You should probably lose weight. You're probably going to find a different doctor. And then you've also got avoidance and delays in healthcare services. So what does this have to do with cystic fibrosis? Now, weight bias in healthcare professionals working with patients with cystic fibrosis is largely unknown. A personal experience that I had, and sort of where this passion of mine stemmed specifically related to care of patients with cystic fibrosis. I was in a meeting and we were talking about the extension study on ETI. And I'm not going to go into these results, but there was a room full of people. Nobody said anything about the improvements in FEV1, the improvements in quality of life, yet this one small little graph looking at the gains in weight in patients taking ETI sparked about a 20-minute discussion about what we should do with weight gain in patients with cystic fibrosis, which I thought was fascinating, right? Not the fact that we've got a huge improvement in quality of life, there was a huge gain in FEV1, nobody talked about any of that. The only thing that we talked about was weight gain. So there's lots of data showing this. The graph on the left-hand side is from the CF Foundation annual report in 2021. The graph on the right side is a Canadian CF registry. Being Canadian, I have put the Canadian data in there as well. Looking at improvements or increases in BMI as well as weight in patients with cystic fibrosis over the years, which can be attributed to a lot of different things. And so I think that this is something we're going to be seeing more and more of. So case 3, this is a patient that I heard about through interactions with some of my adult colleagues. 26-year-old athletic male with cystic fibrosis, spends a lot of time at the gym, strong focus on building muscle mass, really wants to get buff. Reluctantly starts ETI with comments that he doesn't want to get fat. And then there was this other case that kind of was shocking to me. 35-year-old female with cystic fibrosis started ETI about 1 year ago. 23% improvement in FEV1 with a reduction in all of her symptoms related to cystic fibrosis, but the weight gain increased. So let's say there was a weight increase of 20 kilograms with increases at every visit. She's diligent with all of her baseline CF therapies, all of it, and she's very meticulous about making sure she gets everything done. She was told to take ETI with fat-containing foods. And so she's been taking ETI with 1 cup of nuts and a half an avocado every morning and every night, and still has maintained her high-fat, high-calorie, high-salt diet that has been advised to her up until this point. So if you want to get on your phone again, oops, but just give me a minute. It should be, hold on, it should be at the top, but if it isn't, then I think the URL is on the top as well. If it's not, then I will. Yeah, it's on the top there. Sorry, it's really small, but it's on the top, right here, for those of you who can't see. So polleb.com/NITACHAUHAN072. So how would you counsel this patient? Commend adherence. Concerns. Focus on values. Meals, balanced meals. Lots of people talking about goals, discuss goals, I'm assuming. Education, support. So there's lots about education for this patient, lots about talking about goals. It's interesting to see different responses from different groups because, like I said, I've given a similar talk to other groups and had very different responses, so it's very interesting. But going back to the patient, whoops, gotta find my mouse here again. Going back to the patient, This is a patient who probably when she was born was told that she was going to die in childhood with cystic fibrosis. And these are the things that you need to do in order to live, right? And so she's held on to them very, very close because this is a survival mechanism for her. You know, a lot of this probably is wrapped up in her own feelings of mortality and anxieties around that. And I think sort of unpacking that is a really important thing as well for these patients. So I'm doing a survey looking at attitudes towards obesity in healthcare workers, working with patients with cystic fibrosis. That's a QR code for my survey, shamelessly plugging that. So if anybody is interested in taking it, it takes about 5 minutes to complete. But some preliminary data, other healthcare providers in my field, other healthcare providers, not me, but other people in my field, often have negative stereotypes towards people with obesity. Most people agree to this comment, right? And I have heard and witnessed other healthcare providers in my field make negative comments about patients with obesity. Again, most people answered yes to this. And this is somebody else's problem. It's not a me thing, right? And so I think that this is specifically in healthcare workers working with patients with cystic fibrosis. So this is a problem within medicine in general, I think, and I don't think that care for patients with cystic fibrosis is exempt. So I do think that more work needs to be done. Now, if we think about the CF clinic experience for a moment, so you have patients, they register for clinic, they get their height, weight, and PFTs done, they visit with various healthcare providers, then there's lots of comments on weight, either it went up or went down or it stayed the same, and discussions on how to maintain BMI and the impact of that on FEV1, as well as strategies on how to change or modify one's body weight, and repeat this every 3 months, right? So just a quick left for a moment, talking about what is disordered eating. So disordered eating, you've got frequent dieting and anxiety associated with specific foods around meal times. You've got chronic weight fluctuations, rigid rituals and routines around food and exercise. And if you think about that point and how it pertains to patients with cystic fibrosis, specifically in children, parents, as a pediatrician, parents do this with their kids with cystic fibrosis, and it can often result in power struggles between patients and parents or patients and families around food, creating that poor relationship with food and eating. There's also feelings of guilt and shame associated with eating, not specifically with body image per se, but also just with eating. You can have a preoccupation with food, food, weight, and body image that negatively impacts quality of life. And you can also use exercise, food restriction, fasting, or purging in order to make up for bad foods consumed. So if you think about what disordered eating actually is, and then think about how this may pertain to patients with cystic fibrosis, either in a historically protective way in order to maintain weight, to maintain that FEV1, or going forward in the new realm of ETI. So difficult questions for the future, and I don't think we've got an answer for any of these yet. Is weight gain a health problem, or is it an us problem? I would argue to say it's probably an us problem. Are we going to create a new set of problems with the intense focus on weight and BMI in patients with cystic fibrosis? I would suspect yes. And can we as a healthcare team make weight gain acceptable when looking at overall health and well-being of the patient, maybe not just in cystic fibrosis, but weight fluctuations in general in humans, because the bodies do come in all sorts of shapes and sizes. Care for patients with cystic fibrosis has been cutting edge in a lot of different ways. One of the first areas where we truly do have personalized medicine. So I'd love to see care for patients with cystic fibrosis being cutting edge in this realm as well. So happy to take any questions. And I also, again, shameless plug for my survey. So please distribute amongst your clinic partners.
Great. Great job, Nita. We do have one question, and it came up during Dee Dee's talk, but I think either of you can answer. Are the mental health issues correlated with weight gain in persons with CF on ETI?
I think that's TBD, to be honest with you. I don't think we have a lot of information on that, certainly not from the literature that I've seen. But that's a great question.
I would say, I think what this question is getting at is I'm gonna like put myself in this asker's shoes for a moment and say that this is a clinician who wants to know how to support their patients and is wondering, if I see someone gaining a lot of weight, should I be keeping an eye on their mental health? And I would say, regardless, after we know that we should be keeping an eye on people's mental health after Trikafta, and I would say, regardless of the amount of weight gain, I think it's worth assessing for body image issues and disordered eating in all of your patients with CF, regardless of modulator therapy status, since not everyone has access to them. Please go ahead.
Hi, Jade, University of Rochester Adult Program. I have a two-part question. My first was in the setting of like transplant and kind of like BMI, like patients who are focused on meeting like the qualifications for that, how are we kind of like able to base this conversation and still kind of keep that non-weight approach?
That's a good question. My lovely moderator has an answer.
Okay. So there is a lot of talk in the weight neutral community around like gatekeeping for medical surgeries, and kind of right now the general consensus is informed consent and also recognizing where their goals and values are, and we may not fully be able to do this because it's gate kept. There's not like, we'd love to change the rules, but we can't change the rules, and this impacts your health. So it's not a great answer, but it's the best one we have right now.
Thank you. And then my second question is, because I work in CF, but I also work in just general adult primary care as well. And I find that a lot of patients ask about like GLP-1s and want to know about like Ozempic, Mounjaro. So kind of like in the setting of that conversation, also being on like an interdisciplinary team with providers who prescribe these things, like how are we kind of adjusting to that in the CF world?
I can take this.
So I think that's such an awesome question. Like that, those are the elephant in the room right now. And before I talk about them, because I'm a social worker, I have to say, the research tells us that belief in controllability of weight and weight stigma are really linked. And these, like Ozempic, Wegovy, they really give us the impression that weight is controllable. So regardless of the side effects, regardless of the research that supports that the minute you stop taking them, you gain all the weight back, we are really seeing a rise in weight stigma and a surge of articles in the media that really reinforce weight stigma. And I think that surge happens anytime there's some exciting new cure for obesity. We saw it with Olestra, if anyone remembers that one as well. So I heard a lot of murmurs. That was great. So I would say talk with your providers openly about it. It's the elephant in the room, so acknowledge it, ask how you're going to talk about it as a team. And the one thing I would say is start with behavior. Do not start with goals. Start with what you're doing right now. Start with what your daily experience is. And then when people talk about goals, I personally would wait for the patients to bring it up. And I, as a provider or a clinician, would not suggest something without knowing that the patient had an interest in it. Because I think that there is a real risk that we reinforce weight stigma when we ask someone, have you thought about this injection that would help you lose weight? Particularly when, they are already experiencing a lot of weight stigma. So Shannon is going to talk more about how to talk to physicians and interdisciplinary care, but that's one thing I would keep an eye on.
Thank you.
There is a lot of conversation about these. So I actively practice in eating disorders, and so they've done a lot of really great research on how to do informed care. And when you really go into the literature, like the best case scenario for these medications is about 10% weight loss. So I think that's a really important thing. And this was in a highly controlled study with predominantly white men. So to extrapolate that to other races, other ethnicities, other genders, you proceed with caution. And then also to note that, yes, we have the initial weight loss, but at the furthest mark out, there is an uptick in weight, and then they just stopped looking, assuming that then we don't gain any more. And so I think that's something really important, as well as the fact you can never come off of it. Even if you don't lose weight, even if you start gaining weight, you can never come off of this medication.
Thank you.
Okay, one more question, and then I think we're going to have to move on. But I do want to acknowledge that a lot of the questions in the chat are about how do we connect with interdisciplinary care and how do we talk to physicians about this? And Shannon's talk is going to address that. So we're not ignoring those questions. Okay.
I guess I'm not sure who the question is for, but I mean, I think that there are instances where, I know she mentioned transplant, but where the patient is depressed and is overeating and has lost weight in the past when they are not doing that. Or in the instance where I have a patient who's exercising, eating well, and says that because he's gained this weight from the ETI, his belly is so big that it's causing him difficulty breathing now. So how do you address those issues? And they are struggling with their weight, but it is causing health issues. So, I mean, for certain patients, obviously.
Sorry, there's now a... I'm very tall. In terms of the first example, as a clinician, I probably wouldn't necessarily address the overeating per se, but probably the root cause, so address the depression.
Right.
I mean, if there's usually a reason why people are overeating, if they're overeating secondary to a mental health concern. In terms of the second patient, again, I would maybe look into what they're doing and what they're eating. Like my example patient, right? A lot of these feelings are wrapped up in their own sense of mortality and sense of anxieties around that. Maybe they're not fully disclosing everything that they're doing. Studies have shown that whatever weight gain that there is typically in people plateau off. And even then, oftentimes what people are feeling is a product of their own internalized weight bias, which is something that needs to be explored for patients too.
I mean, his weight has plateaued. It hasn't continued to increase, but it doesn't go down either.
Yeah.
So.
Yep. Oh, wow. This is a new feeling for me. When you're 5 foot tall, you get a throne. Hi, everyone. My name's Casey Wilburn. I am a dietitian, and I didn't put it there, but I work at UVA Health Adult Center with DD. I do not have anything to disclose, and I don't have a beautiful disclosure slide as the rest of these ladies have so far. I will say I have never experienced weight stigma in a healthcare setting. That is never something I have had to deal with, so I think that's very important to point out. So today, a lot of this might be a little repetitive with what we've already talked about. I'm the type of person that repetition is key, so hopefully that'll be helpful for some of you. But I'm going to go over the evolution of diet and dieting, additional barriers to the CF population, examples of popular non-dieting approaches, and then what we need to do to move forward with research. So as I was putting this presentation together, this was one of the things I thought was just crazy to look at. And I wanted to do it from our patients' perspective, those who are Googling ideas and thoughts, right? Like that's the first thing we do, we pick up our phone. When you Google dieting, it comes up as this verb, the very first thing you see. And if you look at the similar things below, it's follow a diet, be on a diet, eat sparingly, eat selectively, abstain or fast. It just gets worse and worse and worse. So just don't eat, apparently, is what dieting means. And then if you look up the word diet, it is the kinds of foods that a person, animal, or community habitually eats. And we're talking about food and drink, foodstuffs, provisions. I think it's really important to point out that everybody has a different idea of what this word means, but we can't get away from it. It's everywhere, right? So I think it's really important that we ask our patients, what does this word mean to you? And, I think that'll help guide some of your conversation moving forward. Another interesting thing that I've come across is that the word diet actually comes from the Greek word dieta, which represents a way of life. So Greek physicians used to use this as a form of intervention to influence lifestyle modifications. So for example, if a patient had cardiac dysfunction, they would be counseled on not only limiting their salt, but also emphasizing exercise and sleep. So it was this good holistic type approach, which, as you guys know, everything repeats itself just like fashion, right? So we're trying to get back to that way that they used to talk about it. And once again, I think it's all about perspective and interpretation. That is something that if you ever get in a conversation with me, I will probably say a lot. So have those conversations with your patients. So these are a little absurd, but I think it's important to talk about how we got here. And we've already gone over this a little bit, and these are the extremes. But the first diet book was actually published in 1558, and it was called The Art of Living Long. It advised readers to limit themselves to 12 ounces of food a day and 14 ounces of wine. And the author taught, yeah, sounds great, right? I would not function. So he actually tells the readers that when he increases his food to 14 ounces a day and his wine to 16 ounces a day, his mood changed from joyful to sour. And 12 days following, he developed abdominal pain and a fever. He's very dramatic. But people put weight in what he said. So I think it's important to point this out. Once again, these are extremes. In the mid-1800s is when we really started to get ideal body types, and beauty became associated with exclusively the visuals of a person's body. So I think it's a good question to ask, is this where body dysmorphia really started? Is this when we really got this focus on, what we look like externally? Great conversations to have. And then there was a book published in the early 1900s about Fletcherism. How many of you have heard of Fletcherism? Okay, we have a couple. This one's funny. So the man who published this was Horace Fletcher, and he popularized the idea that food should be chewed until it was thoroughly liquefied before swallowing. And he recommended at least 32 chews. If whatever after that didn't go down the esophagus easily, then you were to spit it out. The worst part of all of this is that he was considered to be an American nutritionist to some. And then finally, Lord Byron. He was kind of like our first influencer, so to speak. He prided himself on periods of restriction followed by binging, and he would try to sweat off any excess gained weight by wearing 6 or more jackets. He was also the inventor of the vinegar diet. Yeah. So he had many more disordered eating habits, all of which became idolized due to his status and his influence on the public. And there were actually reported deaths in that time linking women to drinking pints and excessive amounts of vinegar. So this is the extreme, but we'll get there. And this one's my favorite. The beautiful Vogue diet published in the 70s, which I'm sure some of you have seen. It basically is all eggs, white wine, and coffee, and then you get to treat yourself to a steak at night. There was actually a girl online who tried this for 3 days, and she was not functioning, and she was very emotional by the end of the day, which I can relate to. She did not. I think she lost like 2 pounds, and it was all water weight. She was like, yeah, I came right back. Shocker. So the point of all of this is that although we can look at this and we can laugh and we can say this is absurd, we have normalized a lot of fad diets. The keto diet, the paleo diet, the Whole30, Weight Watchers, intermittent fasting, all of this stuff that, Dee Dee and Nita just talked about, a lot of the research is linked to these and just over-restricting in general and a fixation on these numbers. So when it comes to the CF population, I think it's important to point out that we have more barriers, unfortunately. Dealing with chronic illness affects each patient differently, but it's definitely something that's widespread across our population. There's a large financial burden, which with all the social workers in here, I'm sure that you encounter that plenty. And then psychologically, being taught to fixate on what they're eating for a long period of time, that's something we're trying to get them away from. It's going to be a really hard habit to break. And on top of that, we're trying to change societal norms. So this is a big task. We need everyone in the room to help with it for sure. And then, kind of what was previously mentioned was, we had some patients who used to be in control of their weight. They were told you need to gain more weight. They knew, okay, I need to increase my food intake and eat more calorically dense foods, whether that's eating ice cream every night. Well, now they're being told to lose weight. So they're like, okay, well, I'll just cut back on what I'm eating. And once again, calories in versus calories out is not the solution. And there's a much bigger picture at hand. And like I said, they're overcoming significant changes and fighting with societal pressures. So even those of us who don't have CF, we have societal pressures around the way we look, right? They're dealing with changes and recommendations on top of that. And then longstanding issues with body image, which has also been noted. Research has shown that historically women with CF have had better body image due to low weight, whereas men struggle with body image more, making them more likely to follow recommendations for high caloric intake and consistency with enzymes. So I think that's something really good to point out. This also seems like a lot, so I kind of bolded our current recommendations where I find it important. Our current CF nutrition guidelines are weight-centric focused, and we really want to move away from that and towards a more weight-neutral and inclusive environment. We just need to do the work and the research to help redefine these guidelines. I think a lot of dietitians now hopefully take these with a grain of salt, that energy intake of 110 to 200% for patients older than 2 may not be applicable anymore. And then, in my world, our adults, we're still kind of fixating on a BMI of 22 for women and a BMI of 23 for men, regardless of the rest of their health status. So I think that this is something we really need to work on as a group. So I also think it's important to talk about the evolution of the CF care model, which is something that we've been putting a lot of emphasis on since we started ETI therapy. And I think acknowledging individual patient needs as a population becomes more diverse, and one model will not fit all is so important. I think we can all agree that although our patient population was always diverse, it is a lot more diverse post-ETI therapy, and that's something that's gonna have to be acknowledged to help shift our perspective. So like I said previously, obtain your patient's thoughts on nutrition. Ask them, what does the word diet mean to them? Maybe talking about eating patterns would be a more successful approach, depending on who you're talking to and what their thoughts are. And then seeing a patient as a whole. Their weight's not the only piece to the puzzle, right? We need to be looking at their reported symptoms and how they're feeling and their labs and all of these other pieces that we should be looking at as clinicians. And then also explore other needs and other aspects of health, their physical activity, their mental health. These are all really important. So even if you don't know non-dieting tactics well, this is a really good place to start. Be empathetic, build rapport, right? That's important no matter what we're doing. It's even more important when we're talking about weight bias and non-dieting approaches. Also, remember nutrition information that's circulating is extremely overwhelming. Even some of the research, you can see very clear bias. Some of us are like Google Scholar versus Google. Go on Google Scholar and you can see a lot of stuff around dieting that's clearly very author biased. And there's just a lot of junk information out there. So with that being said, don't be annoyed at your patients when they ask about a new fad diet they're interested in. Like, they said previously, it's very easy for us to be like, no, please don't do that. The research doesn't support it. But you need to listen first and acknowledge that it's totally normal to feel that way. Once again, be supportive regardless of the patient's goal. When weight loss is the question, explore why. This is a common thing, right? We need to figure out what the root of all of this is. If we can help figure out the root, then some of the other stuff is going to work itself out. And then shift the focus to healthy lifestyle. Healthy lifestyle meaning mind, like the psychological aspect, and body. This will differ from patient to patient, but you also need to think about the environment your patients were raised in and take that into account. If weight loss is the question or is what the patient wants to address, ask them what things do you have control of that are increasing your anxiety about your weight. There's so many external factors that we cannot change. So I think, nutrition is always a hot topic for patients no matter what field you work in because it's something people feel like they can control. And I think that's really powerful, and it also makes things more complicated for us. Our changes in eating habits should be aimed to address comorbidities and not weight. So if you have CFRD, focus on habits that will positively influence blood glucose levels and shift that thought away from weight. So this is the actual definition of a non-diet approach to care. It's a practice that puts emphasis on weight inclusivity, self-acceptance, and honing in on one's body cues. Basic principle is weight and body size does not determine health. Instead, health is based on overall well-being, which includes physical, mental, and emotional health. So once again, well-being as a whole. I do think some people may think when they hear this term, it means we're not going to address nutrition or food at all, and we're going to encourage patients to just do whatever they want. And although eating what you want is a very large part of this approach, it's also about being mindful of the things that you're providing to your body and having an overall emphasis on that well-being. The things that we do know about these approaches thus far are that they result in statistically significant improvements in disordered eating patterns, self-esteem, and depression. And as far as we know, they do not result in significant weight gain or worsening blood pressure, blood glucose, or cholesterol. There are a couple studies that actually show significant improvement in biochemical measures as well. We definitely need more research, but what we have thus far is promising. So I'm just going to kind of hit on a couple of the more popular ones you all are probably familiar with. My hope with this talk is to plant a seed and encourage you to go do your own research and look into all of these other non-dieting approaches that exist because we do not have time to cover all of them. This is the intuitive eating principles, which I'm sure most of you have probably heard of. Can you raise your hand if you've heard of this? Oh, yay. Okay, we're already off to a good start. So this one, they've added principles over the years, and it was actually put together by two dietitians who worked in outpatient for a very long time and were very weight-centric focused. And they just saw that their patients kept failing and failing. They were doing these yo-yo diets, and they were frustrated, and their patients were frustrated, and they felt horrible because we all go into healthcare to help our patients, right? And so they were like, maybe we need to rethink what we're doing. So the principles that they came up with are to reject the diet mentality, honor your hunger, make peace with food, challenge the food police, discover the satisfaction factor, feel your fullness, cope with your emotions with kindness, respect your body, movement, and honor your health with gentle nutrition. So as you can see, intuitive eating encompasses many different strategies to help patients build a healthy relationship with food. Our bodies start out as being fully capable of intuitive eating, and then along the way, whether it's because of diet culture or medical conditions, we lose touch with what our bodies are telling us and slip into unhealthy eating patterns. It's very easy to get caught up in the day-to-day and ignore your body. And the first step to intuitive eating is to let go of the diet mentality. It's important to understand that everybody is different and has different nutrition needs. Everybody has different likes and dislikes, and everybody has different levels of access to foods that they want to eat. When we help patients step away from diet mentality and stop comparing how they eat to what others are doing, and realize that the food and drinks that they put into their body is their business, and that the food and drinks that other people put in their bodies is their business, it helps them detach so that they can accept responsibility for nourishing their bodies both physically and emotionally. And then ditching the diet mentality leads patients to stop viewing foods as good or bad. When you have kind of that moral association with foods, it manifests in the person as well. If I eat this bad food, then I'm a bad person. So we really need to move away from that morality connection. And then another important aspect of intuitive eating is listening to your hunger and fullness cues and separating head hunger from physical hunger and exploring the different types of hunger. There is a lot of info out there. If you start looking into really good podcasts or just things you can find about talking about other ways you might realize your hunger. If you can't focus really well, or if you're feeling kind of lightheaded, it's more than just our stomach growling, right? So those are really helpful to help teach patients. So like I said, patients should explore their hunger and fullness cues. Use a hunger scale for guidance. This is really helpful because people don't really know what that means unless you line it out for them, and I'll have one on the next slide that I can show you. There's a lot out there. And then, like I said, discuss non-typical hunger cues, not non-typically because that doesn't make sense. So, like I said, language swaps to help stop black and white thinking goes back to the let's get them away from this food is good, this food is bad. Why do you eat ice cream? Do you eat it because you want a little more calcium in your diet or just because it feeds your soul? That is okay. Feed your soul. You don't just have to nourish your body with food. It's there for a multitude of purposes. And then incorporate mindfulness. Encourage patients to really be present when they're eating their food. And I'll talk about that more in just a second as well. And then, as I previously said, examine other non-weight measures of progress. We really want to look at the whole picture, right? A good clinician doesn't walk into a room and see one thing in the multitude, one factor as in weight, and the whole multitude of things that we have. Labs, physical symptoms. We don't look at one thing and make recommendations. We look at all of it. And then I want you to monitor progress when it comes to physical symptoms by asking questions like, are you feeling stronger? How are your pulmonary symptoms? How do you feel in your head? Do you feel like you can focus at work or just in day-to-day tasks? So this is one of the hunger fullness scales. Like I said, there's many out there, but it kind of helps patients figure out, okay, where am I hitting the hangry, right? Because that's something we're all familiar with. That might be like a 2 or a 3. And generally telling them in between 4 and 7, if they're feeling any of those, is the time to start thinking about eating food or stopping eating food. Because we want to keep them away from the extremes if possible and help them get in tune with their bodies. So mindful eating, the approach for this varies slightly depending on the source of information, but generally it's pretty standardized. Questions that patients should be asking themselves before they eat: am I hungry? Am I thirsty? And what type of food or drink do I want to eat? Just before they eat, they should be checking in with their body. And a fellow RT once said to me, eating mindfully is a transition from an automatic response to something you're fully engaged in. And that's really what our goal is here. I thought that was fantastic. So eating in response to external cues is really common because from a very early age, we're trained to eat this way rather than in response to hunger, whether that's based on the time of day, the availability of certain foods for comfort, to alleviate boredom out of habit, or to clear our plate as a reward, which is something I'm sure people see in pediatrics quite a bit. Slow down while eating. Very simple, right? It's something that we all take for granted. It seems really simple, but sometimes you do have to say it. And then be present in the moment while eating. Refrain from watching television or reading if possible. And even if you can't do this for every single meal, encourage your patients to at least do it here and there, and some of it will come kind of intuitively in the future. Savor your food. I actually listened to a mindful eating book, which was probably a little far-fetched for some of us, unless you're very into meditation and Buddhism. One of the recommendations they made was to have all of your patients put a raisin in their mouth and roll it around and experience the chew and what the texture is like and how they're feeling. It is an interesting tactic, and if you have patients who are willing to do something like that, I think it's a great thing to learn, how to smell and taste and feel the texture of foods. This is part of being mindful when you're eating, is really figuring out what you enjoy about that food or that meal. I would not recommend using a raisin. Maybe pick something that the patient likes. But if you explore more about mindful eating, there are some really interesting recommendations for things you can have your patient try to get them in touch with the food. And then mindful shopping and preparation. This one's a little hard sometimes based off of social factors, right? And just in general, how much time do your patients have? This may not always be feasible. If you have a mom with CF who's got 3 kids, food shopping and preparation may not always be feasible, but if it's something that your patient feels like they can do, it can be very helpful. And once again, even if it's not all the time and it's just occasionally, it can be beneficial. And then remind your patients it's okay to listen to their body. If they've checked in with themselves and they are hungry, they need to honor that hunger. So if they are checking in with their body every few minutes in between the meal and after the meal, they need to honor their hunger. Their body's telling them that they're hungry for a reason. And then health at every size principles. I think this one's really important because it really pulls together not just non-diet approaches, but a lot of what we've been talking about with weight bias. It's kind of the good overview of all of it. When it comes to weight inclusivity, that's when we accept all bodies are different. Shapes, sizes will vary regardless of health status. Recognizing health enhancement involves acknowledging health equity and social determinants of health. And it's one of the most important ways to improve health is by eliminating oppression, which is something that we're trying to do here. Respectful care is acknowledging our own biases and working to end weight discrimination, weight stigma, and weight bias. And then eating for well-being, we're trying to promote individualized eating based on hunger, satiety, nutritional needs, and pleasure rather than any externally regulated eating plan focused on weight control, acknowledging that this may change for patients as time goes on. And then life-enhancing movement. We want to support physical activities that allow people of all size, abilities, and interests to engage in enjoyable movement to the degree at which they choose. If a patient enjoys being outside, walking with their dog, encourage them to walk with their dog every day. If it's something they don't love doing, it's not going to be sustainable. And then you have a whole nother snowball effect of how it's making them feel from a mental aspect, and then we get more fixations off of that. So what do you do with all of these tactics, right? As clinicians, it's our job to help patients navigate this change, not to direct them to read a book. I am directing you to read books, but that's our job, right? So use non-diet approaches that you're comfortable with to help teach them the tools that they need to feel comfortable. I think it's really important to acknowledge that when you get into some of this, for those of us who are not super comfortable with non-dieting approaches, and this is new to a lot of us, that it's okay to be a little hesitant about some of the tactics that are being recommended. Start with those that you believe in. Slowing down and eating your food, that's a very easy thing for all of us to agree is probably a good move in our fast-paced society. So build your own toolbox. Use those tactics that you believe would even be beneficial for you, because when you can relate to your patient on those levels, I think that the things that you're recommending are going to be even more powerful than just reading, the principles of each of these tactics. And then get to know your patients, build rapport, honor their wishes and goals. It's really important to have that rapport when we're trying to make such a big shift. Provide your patients with quality research and steer them away from predatory journals. This is a really, really big one for us. It's our responsibility to provide recommendations based off of good evidence-based research, and it's really hard to find that sometimes. So it's our job to divvy through that for them and to provide that to them in a way that they can understand. That's something they trust us with. And then remind yourself and your patients that this process takes time and it will not occur overnight. So be patient and just take it little by little. Further research that we could benefit from is just assessing changes in body composition and health outcomes related to nutrition status with modulator therapy. reassessing BMI recommendations in the population following ETI therapy, estimating needs in the CF population if this is something we're going to include in care. And I want to point out that a lot of this may be for our knowledge as clinicians and not something that we need to necessarily disclose to our patients, since we are trying to move away from that fixation. But they may be helpful for us to help make that change in healthcare, especially for some of the clinicians that may be a little hesitant to apply these things. And then the outcomes of implementing non-diet approaches in the population with focus on health and psychological outcomes. As we previously mentioned, this is something we definitely need to have more research on in the field of cystic fibrosis. I'm getting real repetitive at this point. You will not forget to listen to your patient's feelings and what they want, and listen with active listening. Get curious about the patient's why. Once again, if a patient comes to you and they say, I want to lose weight, ask them why. Where is this desire coming from? Is it because they have joint pain and they're feeling out of breath? Or is it because Aunt Debbie every year at the family get together is like, oh wow, are you okay? You look like you've gained weight. And then offer support. Once again, common theme, shift the focus to behaviors. And use that toolbox that we have already put together, and then continue to engage in research to help us progress forward. And that's it.
In the interest of time, we're going to move straight into our next presentation. We want to make sure everyone has plenty of time to speak. If we don't get to your question, you can certainly email us through the app. We're going to try to respond to some of them just by text, so you might see a text response in the app. I will personally also be hanging out for a little bit after the session, so feel free to come on up.
Good morning. My name is Shannon Stamper. I'm the dietitian at the CF Center of Idaho in Boise. And you guys have put a lot of pressure on me with all of your questions. So I hope I answer all of them because apparently you want to know about this. Okay. I have no disclosures, but we did think it was important to note that I do have thin privilege talking about this topic. Super important. But just because I have this thin privilege, it does not mean that I have not experienced weight stigma. So our agenda today. So we're going to kind of talk about neutralizing bodies and food a little bit. We're going to get started with ourselves and your staff, and then we're going to go into the physician part and kind of the clinic follow-up, and then we'll do a summary. So our objectives today, we're going to identify ways to start this process. So how do you even start going about this and changing the flow of how your clinic has worked for the last 20, 30 years. And then I'm going to provide some practical strategies for getting providers on board with a weight neutral clinic. So, all right. So first, we're going to talk about ourselves. It's really hard to go into a patient room and advocate with your providers on how to do this weight neutral care when you're going home and weighing yourself every morning, So, and while that's not frowned upon, but you got to at least know where you stand. So then we're going to move on to staff and then last providers. So acknowledge where you are on this food body journey. It doesn't mean you have to totally accept yourself. It doesn't mean you have to be totally weight neutral in all of your life aspects. You just have to acknowledge where you are. And this can include thoughts about your body appearance, food rules that you've practiced for 20 years and don't even remember why, hypocrisy. Let's see. So I thought this was, I liked it. So I don't know who needs to hear this today, but loving what your body looks like is not a prerequisite for treating yourself with respect and kindness. So we can have a hard body image day and still choose self-compassion. So how do we do this with ourselves too? So we're gonna eliminate appearance-related comments and lead by example with your staff and with other people in your life. Just a lot of people think, oh, hey, you lost that weight. That's a compliment. People want to hear that. Sometimes it's not a compliment. So lead by example and just kind of change how you word things. Okay, staff. So you're not supposed to be able to read all this. We'll get into all of it, but this picture is mostly to show that it's a multi-step approach. Having your staff and the other disciplines on board is very, very important. If you're trying to move toward a weight neutral clinic, and then your research coordinator goes in and the patient compliments them on their weight loss, and the research coordinator starts talking about this diet they're on, it's not helpful. So it kind of sends you in a backwards motion. So everyone in clinic needs to be on board. Okay, so acknowledge where they are on their food body journey, and they is the other people in your clinic. So just know, some people might be on diets, some people might be taking weight loss medications. Just acknowledge where they're coming from. Don't demonize anyone for anything. You just need to know where you stand and how you phrase your messages. And total acceptance of their opinions or actions are not required. You don't have to love what they're doing, but just know what you're working with. So start with broad statements regarding bodies and food. So that can be with the non-appearance-based compliments. It can be, when we have like rep lunches, the food table is usually set up outside my office. So I kind of started by hearing like, I'm gonna eat this cookie, I'm gonna be bad today. And like, you're not bad. And like, I worked out this morning, so I deserve a donut. Like, you deserve a donut every day. So it's kind of, so food has no moral value. Like, you're not bad for eating that donut. And just changing things, like instead of saying, you look great, say you look happy today, or you're so helpful. Or maybe if you have to comment on something appearance related, like, I really like your dress, or you look stronger. Like, you've been looking stronger lately. Okay, whoa. Okay, get everyone involved. Again, get everyone involved. So get opinions, especially from your social workers, and everyone in clinic, are how they are handling the switch, and how your message is coming across. So we don't want to say like, this is what we're doing. Oh, sorry. But just make sure that everyone is on board, and at least how the message is coming across, that you're not being a bully about it. Talk about like the books you're reading. In my clinic, everyone is a reader, so we just kind of talk about the books we're reading. If you're reading intuitive eating or a body positivity book, talk about those books too, and kind of the facts that you learn from them. These are magnets. That was the brainchild of one of my respiratory therapists, actually. So I teamed up with my social workers, and we came up with about 20 sayings that we liked. And then we put it out to the team, and everyone voted on the ones that they liked the most. And then we made these cool magnets, and we give them out at family night out events. So people have liked them so far. I also have access to a Cricut machine and can make cool, cool stickers like this. So this is on one of our exam room doors. So it's right by the scale. So the patients can see it, the staff can see it, the providers can see it. So also allow options for weighing. So we're not at the point yet in CF where we can just say, we're not gonna weigh everyone anymore. So we've got to work with what we've got. So this is our weighing setup currently. Last year, I kind of started putting stuff in front of the scale so people can just look at something and maybe just not think about the fact that they're being weighed. So maybe they can find Waldo. And I kind of changed them out with holidays sometimes. And then we got this new scale recently where the number that display, thank you, that displays the number is not directly in their eyesight. So we're not trying to hide anything from the patient. They can obviously go into their chart and look, or they can ask us. If they ask us what their weight is, we're gonna tell them, but they're not just standing there on the scale staring at what their weight is. And so far, I think it's been going well. Okay, so be upfront and vocal about barriers. So this is hard, what we're trying to do and what we're trying to change, because we've all experienced diet culture for most or all of our lives. Social media, past bullying, mom talk. So when I think about mom talk, I love my mom, but growing up, I would be standing next to her. She'd look in the mirror and like, I hate my arms in this shirt. And so that became my inner voice was, I hate my arms in shirts, So thinking about the words you're using, and especially when there's young people around. So I'm trying very hard not to make that my daughter's inner voice growing up. So let's see. Okay, so staff. It's a multi-step approach, and it's gonna take a lot of repeating stuff. Ooh, I went too far, sorry. Okay, so providers, what you all came for apparently. So introduce slow and discuss often. So after every NACFC, my team goes back, and in our next team meeting, we say the one thing, like our favorite thing that we learned from NACFC. And last year, my takeaway was after Erin spoke, and I talked about the weight neutral clinic. And then I started this weight neutral process with the staff. Basically immediately after, like with myself. I started it with myself before I brought it up in the NACFC takeaway. And then I kind of started putting feelers out there with my clinic. And then about 2 months after NACFC, I did a lot of research on weight neutral clinic, both in CF and not in CF. I shared a document on the listserv. If you don't have that, I can send it again with my slides. But I kind of just said, this is the research. I really want to do this, and I would appreciate if everyone could get on board and let me know if you have any hesitations or issues. And luckily for me, I work with amazing providers, and everyone was on board, mostly everyone. So after we went to the Social Work Dietitian Consortium, again, my team, we go back and we share one thing that we learned after a conference. There was many things I could have brought back from the consortium, but I brought back non-appearance-based compliments, and I put up a picture because we still do Teams meetings on Teams. And so I just shared a slide that was on non-appearance-based compliments because I thought it would be helpful for everyone to do both in clinic with the patients and in their own lives. We do journal club, and when it was nutrition, we just did the New Era paper, position paper. So many things to discuss in that paper, but guess what I spent the most time on? So we talked a lot about like the weight neutral and body image stuff. So others, reminders about weight talk during huddles or handoffs or whatever you guys call them. Like you're handing off to a provider, last time I saw them, we mentioned weight, and they just broke down, or they're really, really anxious about their weight. Maybe just don't bring it up today. So you can start with a single patient, you can start with individual patients, and that might be easier than starting as a whole. Okay, so you've put in the hard work. How do you follow up? Put yourself into the conversations. So I had to kind of get outside myself and my lack of confrontation. And I would hear conversations about weight or BMI, and I would just go across the clinic, pull up a seat and sit down. Like, I feel like I should be a part of this. And they were like, oh yes, of course. We were talking, yeah, I overheard and I had thoughts. Would you like my opinion on this? Sometimes that might be no, but it doesn't hurt to ask. So circle back. You need to build on the conversations that you've already had. We have all had decades of diet culture shoved in our faces unwillingly, most of the time, and our ears and our minds. And it will take more than 1 or 15 conversations to kind of get rid of those and kind of filter it out. So I circled back with my providers individually for you. And this is what they said. So, changes in stance on weight neutral care since we have been doing this in clinic. 7 out of the 8 providers that I interviewed are on board. 2 of them went from absolutely no knowledge of this topic to very supportive. And the one that isn't super, super on board was willing to say that it could provide a better relationship. So, positive. It is hard to change habits. One said that they pause before discussing weight now. They don't just go into, this was your weight today, we want to see more, They pause and they read the room, actually, and think, will this talk actually be helpful in this visit? An adult provider gauges satisfaction with their body instead of just saying, this was your weight today and this is your goal weight, But we did also hear that parents still need to hear that their kiddo is growing well. So you can't just go into a room of a 2-year-old and expect just not to bring growth up at all. They just need to know that they're growing well. Even if you don't say a specific weight, if they ask, that's fine. Okay, but peds versus adults. I do see both. I forgot to mention that. I see both pediatric and adult patients. So the majority opinion was that it was equally important for both peds and adults. But it was different depending on their exact age. So how you talk about it and the level of importance is different if the patient is 3 versus 13 versus 33. So your wording is probably going to be a little bit different. This was a quote from one of the providers: weight neutral in a younger patient is different. It's more important to make them feel accepted and not that they need to be perfect. And while I do agree with that, I don't think it's more important in pediatrics. Like, shouldn't all of our patients feel accepted and not that they need to be perfect? Like, I know a lot of adults who should probably hear that they don't need to be perfect. And I think that would help them. So, okay. So has this shift to weight neutral care actually affected your care of patients? 3 out of 8 said no, which is fine. 1 was not at the meeting, which I didn't find out until we did the interview. So it's hard to change care when you didn't actually listen to it. And 1 just totally forgot about it, which is fine. So I think 1 out of those 8 was only a true no. But 1% said they're more aware of the wording and the verbiage that they use if they are discussing weight. 1% said they discuss movement for joy more versus movement for weight loss. Went from saying, you look great when they open the door and when they say hi, they say, it's great to see you, or you're so bright and cheery today. And 1 stopped using the terms overweight and underweight. Okay, pros. I'm gonna go through this pretty fast because I'm running out of time and most of you by now already know the pros, but you can share this with your providers. These are pros coming from other providers. So, more focus on the person rather than the numbers, better relationship with more open dialogue, allows more acceptance for the highly active patients who are not at their goal weight, but they're active, their lung function is fine. You don't need to discuss what their body looks like because they already know. Yep. So less stress around worsening the patient's body image or shame. More pros. Weight neutral care better promotes well-being and confidence, can decrease psychological toll and long-term effects of focusing so heavily on weight. Yes, thank you. Children and adults with CF have many things to think about. And if there is one less thing for them to think about, I feel that this is a win for the patient. I thought that was nice. Okay, cons or challenges. So this is probably where some of us are getting caught up. So parents still want to discuss either way. That's fine. Not addressing the elephant in the room. If I bring it up, am I doing harm? If I don't bring it up, am I doing harm? Whoa. The biggest challenge for 1 is people who are not happy with their weight at a BMI of over 30. And this is where they moved more towards discussing movement for joy versus weight loss, and trying to undo prior knowledge or training. And I think all of us are struggling with that. And that's why this topic is so important. So, and also, how do we do this and still strive to meet the CFF guidelines? And I don't think we know that yet. So, how to get providers on board with weight neutral care as told by fellow providers. Start small. So start with individual patient or dietitian requests for weight neutral care, just with certain patients. Like, this patient has a history of eating disorder, please do not bring up their weight. So start small. Broach the topic with 1 or 2 providers who you assume will be on board. And ask them if they can be an advocate when you bring this up to the whole team. So it's helpful to have someone on your side. And bring this up in a team meeting. So the team meeting is important to make sure that everyone is on board. So you can't just have just you and the providers on board. You can't just have you and your other clinic staff on board. Everyone needs to be at least aware that you're trying to move towards this model. And just because this worked for my team, bringing it up in a team meeting doesn't mean it will work for your team. So this is just what worked for me. I have very good rapport with my team, and everyone was like, yeah, cool, that sounds great. But individual provider follow-up after the initial announcement is super important. And I think I showed that when I was talking about it with one of the providers and didn't even realize they weren't at the meeting because it was a Teams meeting and I can't see everyone's faces on there. So and after you mention it, make sure you follow up, because some people just don't bring up things in a big group setting and might just want to talk to you individually about it. Okay, so with hesitant providers, 100% of the providers that I interviewed said lead with the data and the facts. So, which I think was what I did. So it worked for me. And one even said pure data without the editorial. So just... It wasn't meant in a mean way, I promise. Just like, here's the data. CF-specific data, and then the general population if needed. And I have done that work for you, so don't feel like you need to do that. I have a document. Bring up over and over again patient-specific anecdotes. Like, if you've brought up weight with the specific patient and they're here in clinic that day, remind the provider of that, because they'll probably forget. Just because that's not they deal with the whole patient and you deal with that mostly. So just reminders. And ask about specific hesitations or barriers. So why don't you like this? Or what about it don't you like? What might your barriers be? And reiterate that it's not black and white. So just because you're moving to a weight neutral clinic doesn't mean that you can never discuss weight ever again. So it's just thinking about when it's the most beneficial, and that you can talk about it sometimes. Like, if someone loses 20 pounds in 3 months, you should probably talk about that. But just, that could be with the social worker too. Like, maybe something happened in their life. So it doesn't necessarily have to be black and white. So it also helps to have the RD and provider rapport, which is something that I heard also. And I do have that, and so maybe you're not in that place yet. You need to build that rapport first, so you can work with your staff first. And words are incredibly powerful, and they matter. Direct quote. Okay, summary. Reflect on where you're at, and the accept up there, that is not accept your body. It's accept where you are at in this process, and then improve from there. With your staff, lead by example and include them in the process. If they don't feel included by the process, probably less likely to follow up or help you in it. Positive messages everywhere and constant reminders, so needed. So with the provider, start small, provide the data and the facts, constant reminders, and make peace with slow progress. Just because it's not turning out exactly how you wanted it to be doesn't mean that you're not making small progress. And that's it.
Thank you, Shannon, so much for that excellent presentation. We do have a number of questions, and by far the most upvoted, I know we have a couple of people who want to respond to, and that question is, what are your recommendations for implementing a disordered eating and weight stigma screening in a limited amount of time, about 15 minutes? Are there developed resources for implementing this in the CF population?
This question came up so much that 11 o'clock last night, I threw something together. We don't have time to go through it a whole lot, but honestly, before discussing weight, If you don't, I would highly recommend Jessica Setnick's Eating Disorder Guide. That's where I pulled these questions from. So you can begin to have an idea of, for a weight, one specific patient, on kind of how they're feeling about things and share that.
No, Nita can go.
You can keep going. I was just going to say, we, with much help from our lovely psychiatrist that joins us in clinic, have started using weight bias and body image questionnaires in clinic that we give to patients. So if you want that resource, I'm happy to talk about it afterwards if you come and find me.
Yeah, I would encourage people to use your existing processes. If you already have an existing process for the PHQ and the GAD-7, don't reinvent the wheel. Like, just do what's already working for you. And I think it is really important to have a standardized process so that you're not just kind of vibing it out and catching the people you think you might need it, because the minute you're going on vibes or feelings, there's a chance for implicit bias to creep in. We had a great question earlier about, how do you respond when people are concerned about overeating? And I think that overeating is a place where bias really creeps in. We talk about restrictive eating disorders and people that are underweight really differently from the language we use when we talk about people who are overeating or binge eating. We talk about them being addicted to food, and we respond to that in a really different way. But at the end of the day, an eating disorder is an eating disorder. If you have an eating disorder, you are worried about your body image. They need some very similar treatment. They need help deconstructing issues around body image, regardless. And so I think that having a standardized screening process and a way to respond to everyone is really important.
I only work in pediatrics, and so someone asked about Ellen Satter. So that is a non-diet approach, eating competence in the division of responsibility and feeding. So this is the language I've always used with talking about growth with parents. And again, if we do see a shift from there, it's some really great wording on how to have that conversation. But again, you're also keeping in light what you learned from your questions about weight from the first slide. So I know this is pretty standard. If you've ever taken PEP before, like, these are really good questions to ask in assessment. I know someone was asking, like, how do you do a hunger and fullness cue? Well, if you're asking, how do you feel about how much you eat? And they're like, man, like, every time I eat, I just feel so stuffed and bloated. That is your in to then start talking about that. I'll even use like a cell phone battery and talk about kind of where we're at. And then as far as intervention, because I do come from a non-diet approach of the division of responsibility in feeding, that's what I go to. They even have a position statement, which is really, really helpful on CF. And then, as it's been said over and over and over and over again, focus on health behaviors and problem-solve barriers. We can have people implement barriers. We cannot guarantee outcomes. We cannot, guarantee lean body mass. We cannot guarantee weight loss. And to say that you will do this and this will be the result is potentially harmful.
Terry, go ahead.
Thank you all for wonderful presentations and great information. Really appreciate that. On behalf of, serving on the program planning committee for the CF conference, my question on the app was more related to how do we get this information out at a meeting like this? Because I think that it would be tremendously helpful to get providers there. One of the recommendations that I have, and maybe you have some ideas too, is that, we do evaluations for the conference as a whole that, gets accumulated. We do our own separate ones for dietitians. I think it'd be very helpful for that big general evaluation that you fill out to make that recommendation that providers get this education and this information at the CF conference. So if you feel this is important and that they need to learn this, that would be my recommendation.
Terry, am I understanding correctly that we're basically asking everyone in the room to write a letter to their senator? Like we're telling you you can act right now when you fill out your survey for how awesome this conference was and how much you learned. Please say that one of the things you'd like is an opportunity for physicians and providers to also get this education.
Yeah, absolutely.
I love it.
We did put that message out last year at the meeting. And, they're like, oh, yeah, that sounds great. But it ended up on nobody's program. So,
And
we need your help.
Just a plug, sorry to interrupt, there are some physicians in the room.
Yeah.
Right.
Yes.
I do reckon. And I think that it's like the physicians that are here, the ones that know it and believe it and hear it. So it's getting out to the ones who are still very weight-centric, how to reach out to them. So those are the ones that, and it's, like the dietitians and the social workers, it's like kind of like, this is terrific information. I learned a lot. But on some level, it's, preaching to, we're there, we want more.
Yeah, you guys are
so
in the
it's reaching out to those ones that are still not at that acceptance phase. So, thank you.
Yeah. Is that it? I think we're at time. So I'm going to hope everyone has a fabulous rest of your day, and please reach out to us if you have any more questions.